Hi, I'm Tom Siewert, and today I want to give you a presentation about the amazing human body. It really appears to be fine-tuned for our world. We take it for granted, but the details are amazing, and we're going to go through this. Effectively, we will be doing a book report on two different approaches. One book is The Miracle of Man by Michael Denton, and he focuses on the environmental fitness in the world around us that makes biological adaptations possible. The other book is by Steve Laufmann and Howard Glicksman. They focus on the amazing biological complexity itself. What are the systems going on in our bodies? Let me start with a fun fact. Just think about your body. It runs continuously for about 85 years, and it can do some self-repair. But the basic level, it uses about 130 watts at rest. So that's a little more than an old incandescent light bulb. And maybe 10, 20 of those watts go for your heart, another similar amount, 10, 20 go for your lungs. You have similar amount for your brain, and you put this all together, your whole system, but that's what it takes. Per gram, this output is about 10,000 times more than the sun. So instead of just being like a candle, our bodies are more like rocket launchers, incredible power density inside here, and goes for our lifespan. The basic structure of our bodies is cells. So we think of the simplest cell, it has different components. One of the cell's components is a membrane. Those are the walls that's separated from the environment. So think of an eggshell. The part inside and the shell keeps it from spreading on your counter or in your refrigerator, so you have it packaged there. Same thing with jellyfish. You think of jellyfish just being nothing, but there is a membrane that protects the internal parts of the jellyfish from the environment. Also, the cell, the walls, the membranes have gates to allow things to come and go. There is a little diffusion, but really we need to let volumes of material come in, and we need to export waste. Another component is a framework. Inside, there are microtubules that give support to the cell, and they serve as roadways for transportation inside there. The transport system is really an integrated network of distribution, just like you would see in a city. Some other components in here are the delivery vehicles. There's a little structure called a kinesin that will walk along the microtubules and actually deliver material to specific location. It supplements diffusion, which would be too slow of a process to transport materials. We need energy plants to drive the processes. Our body really runs on chemical energy, separate from the heat energy that we use in our houses or electrical energy we use. Obviously, that wouldn't work inside a human body, so it's a chemical process, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. We need manufacturing that's done in factories, or organelles in the cell where construction occurs, and inside there's ribosomes that are building proteins. Also, we need offices to store instruction, oversee things. We need effectively a police force to maintain order and flow of things. And most importantly, this has to continue running 24/7. There isn't a time where you can shut down and go dormant. The life continues through this whole process. Effectively, it is like a little city. It has all the things that we would find in around us where we live. Here is a schematic of the actual components in a cell with ribosomes and microfilaments and mitochondria. All these products are in there, and they're all essential to life of the cell. The human body is effectively a metropolis of these cells or cities. I live in Denver, which is a composite of many small towns all put together around the core of Denver. There's one city that has a refinery in it. So Commerce City really produces some of the fuel that's transported to some of the localities around the city. To the west, near the mountains, is where the water reservoirs are. So we bring in water to feed this. So that, again, a metropolis really has needs of many different types: water, power, petrochemicals, and they all have to be integrated into this total town. In our body, we have about 30 trillion cells, each of them having the features that we saw in the previous slide, but these cells are specialized. And that brings new capabilities, because not all cells in our body are identical. We have nerve cells, we have muscle cells. All of these things have different functions, and we need those new capabilities. That gives us much more than the simple cell. But they depend on each other for system-wide function. They have to be integrated and controlled, and we'll look at some of that. Now try to imagine a 3D metropolis of the cities and cells. Each individual city needs access to all these critical resources, which might now need to be brought in for quite a distance. Again, in a town, we have electrical power lines, we have fiber optic cables, we have buried power plants, we have water lines. In the cell, in a body, we need to transport that through the bloodstream and endocrine system and a digestive system. You can't hide things underground in a 3D structure. They have to be all integrated in there. Our human body has a dense 3D packing, and that dense 3D packing really increases the logistical and hierarchical issues. How do you tie all these things together? It's really systems of systems that are tied together. And that's one of the amazing levels of complexity in the human body. And one of the things we need now is more control. How do you know when to breathe? We don't consciously need to do that. Or if we're going to be working out or walking up a hill, we don't have to consciously increase our heart rate before we faint. Those systems are in there, feedback and control. And we'll come back to that a little bit and look into how complex that all is. And here are some of the major systems that we see. We have the respiration system, cardiovascular, gastro-intestinal, skeletal, musculatory. And we have nerves for sensing and controlling. We have the skin that's a barrier to the world, to keep us separate, like that eggshell. We can't be open to that. We need to protect the interior. If we didn't have skin, we'd lose too much moisture through evaporation, for example. And there's more. We have the immune system, the endocrine system, the reproductive system. All of these things are working together. But we only have time to cover one. So let's move and focus on respiration. We know that we need oxygen. The cells get oxygen from this respiration process. There's a chemical equation where oxygen plus glucose coming into our system from another direction is burned in the cell. It gives off carbon dioxide plus water plus energy, which is what we really need, plus heat. And again, we need that to keep our body warm. So we're getting oxygen and glucose into the cells, and then we need to take out the carbon dioxide, which if it would build up would poison us. We have too much water, we have to take care of that. We use the energy and we use the heat, all going together. Now plants are doing exactly the opposite. So in the lower right corner there, you see the sunlight coming in, the water coming from below. The sunlight is the source of the energy that takes water and carbon dioxide from the air and produces oxygen for us to breathe. And it produces glucose in the cell, which ends up later as what we eat and use that. Now, the respiration process has different pieces to it. Animal life depends on this reaction. It's a continuous flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide out. In the lungs, the oxygen from this, or what around us, in school you learn that air is about 21% oxygen, but By the time it leaves your lungs on the way out, it's down to 16%. That difference is taken into our body. That's the source of the oxygen. On the other side, the lungs are picking up carbon dioxide from the blood, putting that into the air in our lungs, and then we exhale that, and now the carbon dioxide coming out has gone out by about a factor of 100. So that's really what is happening in our breathing process. So there is oxygen demand in our lungs. The basic amount of oxygen we need is about 250 milliliters per minute at rest. That's very high energy density. If you remember, we now buy things like milk a liter at a time, effectively a quart. So this is about a quarter of a liter. It's about the volume of a fist, a small fist. That is enough energy contained in that oxygen to keep us going for about a minute. But sometime we have a higher demand, and we would need as much as 3.5 liters of oxygen at maximum exertion. But we also know that air is mostly nitrogen. So the oxygen is diluted in there. Our lungs have to handle that flow, and they're sized properly so that even though we have about a fifth of the air coming in as oxygen, they can handle that airflow, and they're shaped to minimize the path length. That means it takes less energy. Your body is designed to minimize the energy taken to get that oxygen into our body. The oxygen travels kind of by two types of flow. The high volume flow is convective. That's what breathing is. We bring air in high volumes, spread it into our lungs, and then when it gets down right to the interface between the air and our bloodstream, it goes in by diffusion. And that's actually very important because I'll come back to showing you that if air would just flow over the surfaces of the alveoli, we would lose too much moisture. So the bulk flow is convective into our lungs, and then over a very short distance it diffuses into this alveolar sac, which is where the actual transfer goes to the blood. There are sensors in our arteries near the brain, and that monitors the level of oxygen and CO2 levels in our bloodstream, and they adjust our breathing automatically. So there is a feedback process that handles how these things work in our body. Our system is keeping track of our breathing. And of course, the blood flow is adjusted, but we're not going to go into that detail. Also, we have sensors that recognize danger. When there's a crisis occurring, we'll automatically increase our breathing to increase the amount of energy we can produce in fleeing from some disaster or danger. When we hold our breath like underwater, your oxygen and CO2 control systems will recognize that you're drifting away from the set point, and they'll try to get your attention until your blood levels are normal. That's why when you dive underwater and are holding your breath, you feel this pressure coming. You feel the need to breathe. That's these sensor systems telling you is get in a mode where you can get another breath of air. So that's tied to other systems. Some are the sensing system, which are measuring these levels of oxygen and CO2 to tell us that we need to breathe. We have other things. We have the actuators. The muscles in our diaphragm and rib cage are what moves that air in and out. So that's what is the actual breathing process. And it has to be timed properly because there's things in our throat. You probably know what it's like to try to breathe while you're swallowing or talk while you're drinking. You'd have to control this. And it's amazing how seldom we have problems. That actually our system is designed pretty well to handle that. We also have other systems, a logic system, which compares the set points to determine the need for the next breath. So the sensors go to control, which are controlling what's happening, and then they go to the actuators. So it's like a whole control system. When I say systems of systems, that's what it means. And it's quite sophisticated. In control engineering, there's something called PID controllers. That stands for proportional integral derivative, which looks at how your response is occurring to what the set point is. You don't want to overshoot, you don't want to undershoot, you need to have the right amount of breathing in there. It has to be optimal. And our bodies have that built in, it handles that. Let's look a little bit at the oxygen transfer. This is a schematic of what these little cells look like. Your body is much more tightly packed. In your lungs, they're very close together. They're so close together you cannot visualize what's there. So this schematic kind of shows you there's small sacs, and your breathing system, as you breathe in, it goes to smaller and smaller chambers until you finally get to these little tiny sacs. There's about 300 million of these little alveoli in your lungs. So they obviously are very, very small, but that's very efficient because they can be right next to the bloodstream. Together, they transfer about 100 trillion oxygen molecules per square millimeter of area from the air to your blood every minute. Now you notice these are very big numbers, millions and trillions coming together, which tells you how small oxygen molecules are, but also the complexity of how much is going on here. There are some chemical engineering things that are very sophisticated and amazing as well. The oxygen strongly partitions to air over water. So it's over 100-to-1 ratio, that air does not want to sit in water very well. The density of oxygen in water is low, which is a challenge for things to grow in water, but still fish and plants can handle it. But you need a flow of oxygen going past. And of course, in water, we have currents. The fish are swimming, so they can transfer over the surfaces quite a bit to make that work. Now, the blood plasma, which is mostly water, can't handle much of that oxygen. It's not as much as we need. We need a much higher flow. Well, there's a solution to that, and that's the hemoglobin in red blood cells. They are very efficient in transferring that oxygen and handling it there. There's about 280 million molecules of hemoglobin in each red blood cell. So again, there's a huge number of these things, and each of those molecules can handle about 4 molecules of oxygen. So each hemoglobin handles 4 at a time. And it's such density, it's about 1/3 of the cell volume is just hemoglobin, which means each heartbeat, about 100 billion red blood cells are transporting oxygen from the lungs. There is a lot of oxygen flowing through there. Counter to that, we have to get rid of the CO2. Red blood cells can carry some CO2, but they're not very efficient. They really go into the blood plasma, and they form a reaction. When you put CO2 in water, it forms carbonic acid. That's the fizz in soda. It comes out. And so you can handle quite a bit there. So think of the bloodstream. You have red blood cells carrying oxygen in, but in return, the plasma is what's really carrying the carbon dioxide out. And there's a gradient. We have oxygen in the lungs going into the bloodstream, going into the cells. Conversely, there's high concentration in the cell of CO2, which goes to the blood and then goes to the air in the lungs. So the blood is carrying one thing in and the other thing out. Also, there's an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, that facilitates the transport process. So we had 100 trillion CO2 molecules leaving. We have 100 trillion oxygen molecules entering. They're transferring back and forth into the cells, and the blood is handling this both ways. Now, the walls are very special too. They're only 1 cell thick. So that's about 1/250th the thickness of a sheet of paper. Amazingly thin, and yet you need that because you want to have efficient transfer of gas. You don't want this as a barrier, otherwise we'd have a hard time living the way we are. Even though they're very thin, they're strong enough not to rupture from the blood pressure on that one side. And they're covered with a surfactant so that the sides of the alveoli, when you breathe out, don't stick together on exhaling, which would be what you see when you have a wet plastic bag. The sides stick together. So there's a lot of engineering all built in there to make this work. We need humidity to keep the sacs pliable because there's blood on one side. If this was on your skin, the alveoli would lose about 500 liters of water a day. We could not handle it. There's no way you can drink enough to keep that much up there. 1,000 times more than what we do. So the bottom line is you're losing about half a liter of water. When you wake up in the morning or maybe at night you wake up, you're thirsty. That's because you're losing some water, but much less than you were if you had this flowing over the surface somewhere. The sacs are very tiny, 200 micrometers. Yet together they have a surface area of 130 square meters. That's effectively the size of most houses, one floor of your house or a tennis court. All of that surface area is folded up into your lungs. That's equivalent to folding a piece of paper into a thimble to get that surface area inside there. Just as an aside, I don't know if you know that you can only fold a piece of paper maybe 6, 7 times, and then it just becomes impossible to fold it. As a test, you might just want to try that. How many times can you fold the paper in half? And yet here, it's incredible density, and that's what we need. We need to take a small space in our lungs to handle that oxygen transfer and across these small surfaces. Also, there's another type of alveoli cells that can actually replace some damage. But don't start smoking because they can't keep up with the damage that's occurring. They are interfacing with the circulatory system. Even though we're not focusing on blood, we're focusing on respiration. That's what's transferring the oxygen. So there's about 25 trillion red blood cells, each of them with hemoglobin. Each heme, which is one of these molecules, carries 4 molecules of oxygen with you. Over your lifetime, each red blood cell makes hundreds of thousands of circuits traveling hundreds of miles. Now, there is wear and tear involved with that, and because of that, our body has to make 2.5 million new blood cells every second to replace the ones that are damaged and taken out of our system. So it's continual replacement going on. Sometimes people are anemic because they don't have enough to replace it and they have to have a transfusion. The blood cells are pretty durable, flexible, and strong. They have to be because they go through deformation as they squeeze through capillaries. The smallest capillaries are only about half their diameter. So there's one reason they're wearing out. They are continually flexing as they move. Okay, we've been looking a lot at the body and the fine-tuning of the body. Now, the other book was really the fine-tuning of nature. And we have to realize that that is providing what we need for our body. If we didn't have photosynthesis, there would be no free oxygen. Astronomers are looking for oxygen on exoplanets, which would be an indication of life. We don't see much of that. Yet we have oxygen here. That's why life is existing here. Also, we need water. Without water, we wouldn't have a carrier for the blood cells or for a way to transport the extra heat out. So water is critical to our way of life. We look at other planets in our solar system, we don't see oxygen, we don't see water. Also, we need other things. We need transition metal. They catalyze oxygen to carbohydrates. And just as a comment, many of you take vitamins. You look at the list of your vitamins, those are other elements that our body needs in smaller amounts. Even though we're focusing on oxygen and water and glucose, we need the iron to make hemoglobin. We need magnesium to make chlorophyll. All those things are important to us. Oxygen is a very strong oxidizer. I mentioned it has very high energy level, that a quarter liter of oxygen can keep us alive for a minute. But it's very reactive at high temperatures. And that's what fires are, but stable at room temperatures. That's an important difference. At room temperature, we don't have a lot of fires starting. It needs some ignition source, which could be lightning, it could be a match. Other than that, oxygen is quite stable near room temperature. But in our body, we don't have a match. We have transition metals like iron, which are catalysts that facilitate the binding of the oxygen with the hemoglobin to keep it in there. And we have other transitions to make the processes go in our body. Plants need oxygen at night too. So the question asked is, how could plants start in a CO2 environment? CO2 is one of the few gaseous oxides. Most other are solids, but because CO2 is gaseous, we can transport it through the bloodstream very efficiently without having chunks of oxide that would have to come out effectively like rock. How could complex animals form without some of these systems in place already? And why would the systems be there before they were needed for life? Let's look a little bit at water. Every day, almost 1,000 cubic kilometers of water evaporate from the ocean surfaces. That water then moves around through the air as humidity, keeps our skin moist, our sinuses moist, and then it moves through the system. After it irrigates land, its low viscosity, which is the ability to flow well, facilitates a rapid return to the ocean. Its solubility for carbon dioxide facilitates the breakdown of rock, releasing nutrients that the plants need. Again, the plants aren't just using the carbon dioxide and water. There are minerals coming out of the soil that are needed for the plants, but they're there because water is bringing them and providing them. It's an effective solvent, means it can transport the nutrients through the soil from where they're broken down. Also, a factor there is the heat capacity of the oceans is enormous. It buffers the world temperature by 4 to 6 weeks after the solstices. That means the longest day of the year is not the hottest day of the year. The hottest day comes maybe 4 to 6 weeks later. Likewise, in the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year is not the coldest day of the year. It comes 4 to 6 weeks later, typically about February. If we did not have the oceans, the swings in our climate would be maybe twice as much. The summers would be much hotter, the winters would be much cooler. And of course, that heat capacity is important for us in our bodies as well. Sunlight is very important to run photosynthesis, but only a narrow band of electromagnetic radiation is suitable for photosynthesis. Fortunately, half of the sun's output is in this band. Is that just a coincidence? Most of the rest is infrared that heats the earth. That's why it's warmer during the day and cooler at night. At night, we are radiating that heat back into space, but it heats us during the day. If we didn't heat that way, Earth would be very cool. Other stars, as we look around the galaxy, are much hotter or colder. Also, our sun's output is very stable over time. All of that is very important to make things work right for us. All these things are finely tuned. Oxygen is special. What other materials could react in the body? Well, halogens are more reactive. Many other things are not reactive enough. Halogens are too reactive to accumulate in the atmosphere, so we would lose them. Oxygen is fine-tuned for what we need. Oxygen proportion is critical. If we were down to 10% of the current level, only very tiny creatures could exist, that we couldn't have the complexity of life. They estimate that creatures would be limited to a millimeter, a tiny speck. If we had much more, we have uncontrolled fires. Free oxygen is unstable. It's replenished by photosynthesis, and again, that implies life on a planet. If we didn't have that free oxygen, we just couldn't exist here. If plants weren't around, oxygen would disappear and life would stop. The excess UV coming from outside the atmosphere is filtered by the ozone. We think of the ozone level. That's very important. I've gone through an incredible list of things here. Here's the two major sources again to remind you of them. They're both published by Discovery Institute. The Miracle of Man, again by Michael Denton, is the environment effect, and Your Designed Body by Steve Laufmann and Howard Glicksman go into the details inside our body. But the question for you to think about is, how could the complexity of the human body come through chance? There's two views of how we came to be. One view is Darwin's view of random variation and natural selection explain all of it. That's how it all came to be. The other one, intelligent design, says this is way too complicated to have these interacted systems that are feedback loops and control. It's just too much there. So the question is, how could this evolve if you want to take the random approach? Today, we cannot even fabricate a living cell from non-living components. Then the next step is, how could all those systems evolve? They're all interrelated. Each one is needed. If you just have one, it just can't function on its own. So I think the bottom line is those who say evolution is proven are way too optimistic. So which of these views make sense to you? Could things occur on a random process through evolution? Or is there intelligent design out there? That's a very important question for you. And let me just finish by giving sources. The Cell reference comes from this site, and other figures were produced by Luke Petros. Thanks for your time. I hope this is giving you something to think about. Could these systems just come about through random chance? Or is the linking of systems and systems so complex that it really requires an intelligent designer?